It started as just another Joe Rogan episode, banter, laughter, and brutal honesty. But what came next sent shockwaves through the royal corridors. With millions watching live, Rogan suddenly uttered a phrase that no one could ever take back. "She's the dumbest duchess." Within minutes, the clip exploded online. Twitter caught fire. Reddit turned savage. And in Montecito, Meghan Markle's team scrambled to control what was already spiraling into a global humiliation. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it seemed like a fleeting remark, a careless jab from a man known for unfiltered opinions. But this time, something was different. The world didn't scroll past. It froze, replayed, and shared. The soundbite spread like wildfire, carried by every social media algorithm hungry for outrage. News outlets snatched it up within minutes, packaging the clip under headlines that screamed scandal and mockery. For Joe Rogan, it was another viral moment. For Meghan Markle, it was personal. Rogan's podcast wasn't just any platform. It was the digital coliseum where reputations rose and fell overnight. His audience wasn't a niche corner of the internet, it was a global army of millions, tuned in for raw conversation and fearless confrontation. When he spoke, people listened. And when he mocked, the world laughed. That was the power. He wielded a power Meghan had spent years trying to escape. Within hours, her name was everywhere again. Number Dumbest Duchess trended across social media, layered with memes, parodies, and merciless commentary. Every late-night show had a punchline ready. Commentators debated whether Rogan had gone too far, but few defended her. The internet thrives on easy targets, and Meghan has always been one. Her every gesture, every word, every emotion had long been dissected, twisted, and weaponized. But now, the ridicule has reached a new low. Inside the royal watching circles, opinions were sharply divided. Some royal commentators chuckled at Rogan's audacity, calling it blunt but fair. Others recoiled, arguing it crossed the line into cruelty. But beneath their commentary lay a deeper truth. Rogan's insult had hit a nerve that stretched far beyond a celebrity feud. It had reignited an old debate. Was Meghan truly misunderstood, or had she become everything she claimed to despise? The irony was bitter. Meghan had built her post-royal identity on empowerment and independence. She had fought against silence, claimed her voice, and demanded respect. Yet here she was again, reduced to a headline, her worth debated in podcasts and comment sections. What was meant as a throwaway comment had become a mirror reflecting her deepest fears, that no matter how far she ran from the palace, it would always define her. The media frenzy swelled. Analysts dissected Rogan's tone, Meghan's silence, and Harry's potential reaction. Every public figure chimed in, some defending Meghan as a victim of misogyny, others mocking her as a symbol of modern entitlement. The narrative spun wildly out of control, feeding the machine of clicks and outrage. What began as a joke had become a cultural moment, one that blurred the line between entertainment and humiliation. And yet, under all the noise, a quieter storm began to brew. Those close to Meghan spoke of sleepless nights and whispered arguments. Her team debated strategy. Should they confront Rogan or let it die out? But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't over. The insult had cut deeper than words. It had reopened old wounds, the ones the crown had left behind, the ones fame refused to let heal. Because it wasn't just a podcast. It was about power. It was about a woman who had dared to challenge an institution, now being dragged through another public trial, this time, not by tabloids, but by culture itself. The world was laughing. But behind palace gates and Montecito's mansion walls, something much darker was brewing. The cameras didn't see it, but inside her California estate, Meghan's fury was volcanic. Sources close to her claimed she threw her phone across the room after hearing the clip. Years of criticism had hardened her, but this felt different. This wasn't a tabloid headline. This was open ridicule from one of the world's most influential voices. And Meghan, for once, wasn't just hurt. She was humiliated. For years, she had endured whispers, accusations, and the heavy weight of public judgment. But this insult cut through all layers of resilience she had carefully built. It wasn't about her title anymore, it was about her intelligence, her dignity, her very identity. In the echo of Rogan's laughter, she heard something more than mockery. She heard dismissal. To him, to the millions who tuned in, she wasn't a woman who fought for independence, she was a joke. That realization shattered something deep within her. Harry tried to console her. He spoke softly, trying to calm the storm, reminding her that this was just noise, that she'd weathered worse. But his words felt hollow. Meghan wasn't angry at Rogan alone. She was angry at the world that seemed to enjoy her downfall, that found humor in her pain. The walls of her carefully constructed peace, her Montecito sanctuary, her projects, her carefully curated public image, suddenly felt paper thin. And for the first time in a long time, she felt small again. Those close to her recall the silence that followed. She walked in circles, eyes wide, mind racing, replaying every second of that clip. "How dare he?" she whispered again and again, as if the words themselves could rewrite what had already been said. Advisors and PR managers rushed to her side, urging restraint. They reminded her that responding directly to Rogan would only fuel the fire. But restraint was the one thing Meghan no longer had the luxury to offer. Every instinct in her screamed for confrontation. What the world didn't see was the depth of her exhaustion. She wasn't just fighting a podcast host. She was battling years of ridicule that had become her shadow. Every insult carried the weight of every headline that once questioned her worth. She had clawed her way from the British tabloid's cruelty to Hollywood's polite distance. But it always came back. The laughter, the smirk, the dismissive tone. This moment, this insult, was the embodiment of everything she feared the most, being reduced to a caricature. In the quiet of the night, after the calls ended and her team dispersed, Meghan sat alone in her study. The anger had cooled into something colder resolve. She scrolled through comments, the endless waves of mockery, and each one deepened the ache in her chest. The world's reaction was cruelly predictable. Jokes, memes, endless debates over her character. Yet buried among the noise was something else, a growing conversation about sexism, about how powerful men used their platforms to ridicule women they didn't understand. A spark she could use. Harry watched her closely, knowing that look, the one she wore when she was about to turn pain into power. But this time, he hesitated. The line between standing up for herself and reigniting another media war was dangerously thin. He urged her to wait, breathe, and think. But Meghan was done thinking. She was tired of waiting for the world to understand her side. The silence that once protected her now felt like complicity. Her team drafted statements, retracted them, redrafted again. Nothing felt sharp enough. Nothing captured the fury that burned inside her. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted vindication. And slowly, that anger began to crystallize into something strategic. Her silence wasn't submission, it was a gathering storm. Because Meghan Markle wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to make the world listen, even if she had to burn through every illusion of calm to do it. And when she finally struck back, it wouldn't be subtle. It would shake even Hollywood's elite. 2 days later, silence broke. Meghan's team moved swiftly, but this time there would be no carefully measured statement, no diplomatic phrasing to dull the edges. The Duchess wasn't retreating, she was preparing for war. It began with a single cryptic post. A black background, a sharp caption about toxic masculinity disguised as humor, and a promise that her truth was coming. Within minutes, the world knew exactly who she was talking about. Joe Rogan had opened a wound, and Meghan was done bleeding quietly. Her message wasn't rage, it was strategy. Every word, every pause, carried intent. This wasn't about revenge, it was about redefining the narrative. For too long, Meghan had been labeled, mocked, and misunderstood. Now, she would turn the insult into a cause. Her PR team pivoted immediately, reframing the controversy as part of a larger cultural reckoning. They painted Rogan's comment not as a personal attack, but as proof of how easily powerful men could mock and diminish women who dared to challenge tradition. It was a calculated move, and it worked. Influencers, activists, and Hollywood allies rallied around her almost instantly. Major figures began posting under the newly minted hashtag number #StandWithMeghan, while feminist organizations called Rogan directly. The conversation spread beyond entertainment. It became a question of values. Was this freedom of speech or a reflection of society's double standard? For a moment, Meghan wasn't just a duchess in exile. She was the face of a movement. The same media that once mocked her was now amplifying her voice, dissecting every line of her post as if decoding a manifesto. But with every wave of support came an equal wave of fury. Rogan's followers struck back, flooding timelines with counter-arguments and memes. They accused Meghan of playing the victim, of turning criticism into opportunism. What began as an insult had now become a cultural fault line, dividing audiences worldwide. Podcasts, talk shows, and late-night hosts debated the feud like a national crisis. Was Rogan cruel or just honest? Was Meghan brave or manipulative? The world picked sides, and neutrality was no longer an option. Still, Meghan had the upper hand. The real blow came when her team dropped a 30-second teaser from an upcoming interview, her first in months. The clip showed her sitting in silence, eyes fierce, voice steady as she said, "When people profit from women's pain, that's not comedy. That's cowardice." It was raw, bold, and unmistakably directed at Rogan. The internet erupted again, but this time the tone was different. There was power in her calmness, in the way she turned humiliation into defiance. Every outlet replayed the clip. Every social feed carried her quote. Even her harshest critics admitted it was a masterstroke. She wasn't reacting, she was reclaiming. And for the first time since Rogan's insult, Meghan was not defensive. She had taken control of the story, reframed it, and set the stage for something far greater. But while Meghan fought in the open, her every word reaching millions, another battle was unfolding quietly behind closed doors. Because as she declared her defiance to the world, the royal institution was watching, and they weren't sympathetic. Inside Buckingham Palace, there was no laughter, only quiet calculation. Courtiers whispered that King Charles himself had been briefed. The royal family had long distanced itself from Meghan's Hollywood drama, but this was different. The monarchy's name was once again tied to a public spectacle. As one insider said, every time she fights, it drags the crown with her. Silence wasn't neutrality anymore, it was a strategy. Behind those gilded doors, tension simmered. Palace aides gathered in hushed meetings, balancing their teacups as if afraid to spill more than just the liquid inside. Every conversation carried the same question. Should they respond or let the chaos burn itself out? Tradition dictated silence. The crown, after all, never complained, never explained. But in an era of 24-hour news cycles and viral outrage, silence was no longer safe. It was a risk. The monarchy, once untouchable, now found itself woven into a narrative it could no longer control. Reports suggested that King Charles, ever cautious, ordered restraint. He viewed Meghan's feud with Rogan as a distraction, not a disaster. But others weren't so patient. Prince William, according to palace sources, was furious. The idea that the monarchy's reputation could be dragged into yet another headline because of his brother's wife reportedly reignited old frustrations. For William, the royal brand was a sacred symbol of continuity and discipline. And yet, time and again, it was being pulled into the chaos of modern celebrity warfare. Advisors debated strategy behind closed doors. Some urged an official statement condemning Rogan's remark, framing it as a defense of women rather than Meghan herself. Others warned that any intervention would only validate her relevance and invite another wave of scrutiny. "If we comment," one aide reportedly said, "we step into her world. And once you step into her world, you don't come back clean." The line between tradition and modern media had never felt thinner. The unease ran deeper than anyone admitted. The royal family's struggle was not just a controversy, it was about control. For centuries, the monarchy mastered the art of silent influence. But in this new age of podcasts, social media, and viral outrage, their silence no longer shaped perception and surrendered it. The internet didn't wait for official responses. It wrote its own version of the truth. And every meme, every hashtag, chipped away at the institution's mystique. Inside the palace, aides feared another media circus moment. Memories of Oprah's interview, of the global shockwaves it sent, still haunted the staff. Every mention of Meghan's name triggered the same dread, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. The tension between the old world and the new, between monarchy and modernity, between silence and survival. The institution was watching her every move, but it could no longer predict her next one. Even the issue of free speech began to divide the corridors. Some sympathized with Rogan, calling his remark crude but honest. Others saw it as emblematic of the disrespect Meghan had long endured. But the debate wasn't about right or wrong. It was about optics. The crown existed on perception, and perception was slipping from its grasp. And at the center of it all was Harry, once the monarchy's beloved rebel, now its most complicated liability. Insiders whispered that he had reached out privately, attempting to mediate between the storm surrounding Meghan and the palace's growing frustration. But it was too late. His world and theirs no longer aligned. He was caught again between duty and devotion, heritage and heart. As London strategized in silence, Meghan's world was shifting thousands of miles away. Because just as the palace debated damage control, a voice from her past was about to step into the chaos, one she never expected to hear from, and one that would turn the entire narrative upside down. When a figure from her past publicly defended her, the world gasped. Piers Morgan, the man who once led the charge against Meghan Markle, had done the unthinkable. In a tweet reverberating through media circles, he wrote that Joe Rogan's remark had crossed the line. The post spread like wildfire, igniting confusion, disbelief, and shock. For Meghan, it was surreal. The man who had once built his reputation tearing her down was now calling for decency. Enemies were becoming allies, and allies were suddenly silent. Behind closed doors, Meghan's team was stunned. Even her closest advisors hadn't anticipated this twist. There was quiet satisfaction in the air, mixed with disbelief. Meghan herself was said to have stared at the screen in silence, her lips parting in something that wasn't quite a smile. After years of being called manipulative, attention-seeking, and insincere by Piers Morgan, his unexpected defense was almost poetic. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was validation, the kind that no PR campaign could buy. The world reacted instantly. Headlines couldn't get enough of it. Piers defends Meghan. The critic turns protector. Is this a turning point? Commentators scrambled to interpret his motives. Some believed it was an attempt at redemption. Others claimed he was simply seizing another opportunity to dominate the news cycle. But for once, the spotlight wasn't on Meghan's flaws. It was on society's cruelty. Conversations began to shift from mockery to introspection. Was this what the modern world had become? A place where empathy only arrived after someone had been publicly broken? Social media was torn in half. Some hailed Piers's reversal as a sign that maybe the tide of public opinion was finally changing. Others mocked him for hypocrisy, recalling his years of venom toward the Duchess. Yet, regardless of motive, his words carried weight. Overnight, the debate surrounding Meghan took on a new tone. She was no longer the spoiled royal dropout, she was a woman standing against ridicule. For the first time in years, the crowd was listening. Inside their house, Harry reportedly felt a quiet sense of pride. The backlash that had once painted Meghan as the enemy was beginning to turn in her favor. The noise, the endless ridicule, the cruel labels, they were losing their grip. He saw strength returning to her, the same determination that first drew him to her. For Meghan, it wasn't just about winning public sympathy. It was about regaining her dignity. She had endured years of headlines, questioning her worth. Now, the narrative was cracking, reshaped by irony and truth. The shift was undeniable. Journalists who once mocked her began to debate the ethics of media cruelty. Former critics softened their tone. And through it all, Meghan stayed silent, letting the storm work in her favor. But silence was never her endgame. It was preparation. Piers Morgan's unexpected defense had done more than vindicate her. It had reignited her confidence. Because deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. The world had watched her take the blows, rebuild her voice, and now she was ready to use it again. And then, as if fate demanded a final reckoning, Joe Rogan responded, unfiltered as ever. Rogan didn't back down. In a follow-up episode, he laughed off the backlash, saying, "If calling out hypocrisy makes me the bad guy, so be it." His tone was casual, almost mocking, but his words poured gasoline on an already raging fire. The clip spread like wildfire, flooding social media feeds. His fans roared with approval, cheering him for refusing to bend to what they called Hollywood outrage. But something in the air had shifted. This time, the laughter carried a sharper edge. For the first time, Rogan seemed to underestimate how far Meghan was willing to go when pushed to the edge. His defense was unapologetic, even triumphant. He painted himself as the voice of reason in a world ruled by cancel culture, claiming Meghan's reaction proved his point. To him, it was all theater for another skirmish in the endless war between free speech and sensitivity. But what he failed to see was that this was no longer about humor. For Meghan, this was about identity, legacy, and power. Every joke now carried the weight of every insult she had endured, and Rogan's refusal to step back turned a controversy into a confrontation. Public reactions split the internet in two. His supporters hailed him as fearless, a man who said what others were too afraid to. Meghan's defenders, however, saw cruelty masquerading as courage. The media seized the divide, framing it as a cultural battle, comedy versus compassion, freedom versus fairness. Late-night hosts debated it, journalists dissected it, celebrities took sides. For days, the story dominated global headlines, turning into something far larger than a feud. It was no longer about a duchess or a podcaster. It had become a referendum on modern discourse itself. Inside Montecito, Meghan's team moved into crisis mode. Legal advisors were quietly called in. There were whispers of defamation, questions of intent, and hours spent analyzing transcripts. Some within her circle urged restraint, warning that legal action would only fuel Rogan's narrative of persecution. Others insisted this was the moment to strike back, to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped away. And while Meghan listened, her silence was telling it wasn't submission, it was calculation. She was studying Rogan the way he had studied his guests, waiting for the perfect moment to counterpunch. Harry, meanwhile, found himself caught once again in a familiar storm. He wanted to protect his wife, but feared reigniting another global spectacle. Friends close to him described sleepless nights and tense exchanges. Harry pleading for calm, Meghan standing firm in defiance. It wasn't just about public image anymore. It was about principle. For Harry, Every word Rogan spoke echoed the same ridicule his mother once faced, the same cruelty dressed as commentary. And that, more than anything, made this battle deeply personal. As the feud intensified, even Rogan's audience began to fracture. Some loyal listeners started questioning the tone, the relentless mockery. Was it still comedy, or had it turned into cruelty? The line between wit and malice began to blur, and Rogan, so used to being untouchable, suddenly found himself under scrutiny. The arrogance that once fueled him now looked like recklessness. By now, the story had outgrown its players. It wasn't just about Meghan and Rogan anymore, it was about what they represented. Two worlds colliding. Old power against new defiance, cynicism against vulnerability. The feud had become symbolic of something deeper. A society tearing itself apart over who gets to speak, who gets to laugh, and who pays the price when words cut too deep. And just when it seemed the conflict had reached its boiling point, when both sides had said all they could, Meghan made a move that no one saw coming. A decision so bold that even her closest allies were left in stunned silence. In a televised special titled "The Price of Being a Duchess," Meghan broke her silence before millions. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke about the cost of living under constant scrutiny, the exhaustion of defending her humanity, and the pain of being reduced to a headline, or worse, a punchline. "For years," she said, her words cutting through the silence, "men who never met me have built careers mocking my life. They don't know my truth, they only know my name." Viewers across the world fell quiet. By the time the interview ended, social media was in meltdown. This wasn't a statement, this was resurrection. The timing was no coincidence. Meghan's team had strategically chosen the exact week of Rogan's highly publicized live event, ensuring that her story would dominate every feed, every headline, every trending list. It was a move as bold as it was ruthless. Overnight, the power dynamic shifted. For months, Rogan had defined her through his laughter. Now, she was defining herself through her pain. Her message wasn't just emotional, it was surgical. Every sentence, every pause, seemed to cut into something deeper. Fame, misogyny, and the unbearable loneliness of being misunderstood. The interview was raw, even haunting. Meghan spoke of sleepless nights, of losing her sense of self in the glare of public ridicule. She admitted to moments of weakness, of anger, and of questioning whether her fight for independence had been worth it. Yet through her vulnerability came strength. "I refuse to be silent," she said softly, "because silence protects the wrong people." It was a line that instantly went viral, quoted by activists, influencers, and journalists who hailed it as her defining moment. The woman once painted as manipulative and entitled was suddenly being seen as courageous, articulate, and painfully human. Sympathy poured like a tidal wave. Major publications reversed tone, calling it a masterclass in controlled vulnerability. Hashtags like #We Hear You Meghan and #The Price of Being Human flooded social media. Celebrities who had once stayed neutral began voicing support, describing her interview as a moment of reckoning for how society treats women in power. For the first time in years, the public seemed ready to listen, not to the caricature of a duchess gone rogue, but to the woman behind it. Still, not everyone was convinced. Critics accused her of playing the victim, of weaponizing emotion for relevance. Some said it was too calculated, too perfectly timed. But even they couldn't deny its impact. The world wasn't laughing anymore. The same media that once mocked her were now asking whether they had gone too far. The story had turned out that Meghan was no longer the subject of mockery. She was the symbol of resilience. Behind the curtain, Harry watched with quiet pride. For him, this was more than an interview. It was vindication. He'd seen the toll the ridicule had taken, the way she carried her hurt like a hidden bruise. Now, she was standing tall again, reclaiming her narrative with precision and grace. But as the applause echoed across digital screens, a chill lingered beneath the celebration. Meghan had reclaimed her power, but power always comes at a price. Because somewhere across the fader ocean, Joe Rogan was watching too. And while Meghan's words dominated the headlines, Rogan was preparing his next move, one final response that would flip the story all over again. The morning after Meghan's interview, Joe Rogan did something no one expected. There was no stage, no guests, no sponsors, just him staring into the camera. "If she's hurt, I get it," he began, his tone steady, his voice quieter than usual. "But don't play victim when you live off the spotlight." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was raw, stripped of the bravado that usually defined him. And with that, the entire narrative shifted. What had started as an insult had turned into reflection. Suddenly, it wasn't about one woman versus one man. It was about what happens when two people, both addicted to influence, both trapped by fame, collide in public view. For the first time, Rogan sounded human. He spoke of how fame distorts truth, how everyone believes they understand the person they see through a screen, but they don't. "We all perform," he said, "and sometimes we forget we're still people underneath." His words hung in the air, unscripted, unpolished, and strangely sincere. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. It was something more dangerous: honesty. And the world didn't know what to do. Within hours, the internet fractured again. Some praised him for maturity, for showing restraint where there could have been mockery. Others accused him of manipulating, softening his tone to protect his image. But beneath all the noise, one truth began to settle. The feud had lost its venom. The laughter, the anger, the mockery, all dissolved into a strange kind of silence. Audiences weren't picking sides anymore. They were thinking. Even Meghan's inner circle felt it. According to insiders, she watched the clip alone, replaying Rogan's words repeatedly. This time, there were no sharp retorts, no press releases waiting in the wings. Just exhaustion. Not defeat exhaustion. After weeks of headlines, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind something hollow. For the first time, she didn't feel angry. She felt seen not for who she was, but for what she had become. A reflection of a world obsessed with power, validation, and pain dressed as relevance. The media, always hungry for interpretation, pounced again. Analysts and commentators began reframing the feud as something deeper, a mirror of modern culture's sickness. They asked the uncomfortable questions. When does accountability turn into humiliation? When does criticism become cruelty? And how much of ourselves do we sacrifice for attention? Suddenly, the story was no longer about a duchess or a podcaster. It was about all of us, about how fame consumes those who chase it and mocks those who try to escape it. The emotional tide began to turn. Articles that once ridiculed Meghan now questioned the morality of constant scrutiny. Podcasts that mocked Rogan's arrogance began discussing his vulnerability. For a brief moment, both the Duchess and the comedian were stripped of their armor. Two people who had spent their lives commanding attention were now quietly exposed, human and flawed in equal measure. Those close to Meghan claimed she cried that night not from humiliation, but from release. The battle had ended, and yet it left her changed. She realized that victory in the public eye was never truly victory at all. It was a transaction one that demanded pieces of her soul in exchange for fleeting validation. And though she had regained control of her narrative, she knew the price she had paid to do it. Experts called it the modern tragedy of fame. What began as a clash of egos had become a cautionary tale, proof that in the age of exposure, no one wins. Pride had been shattered, illusions dismantled. What was left was something almost poetic, a silence that said more than all the noise ever could. But as the cameras turned away and the world began to move on, one question lingered in the quiet. What happens when royalty meets reality and neither wins? Weeks later, the headlines faded, but the tension didn't. The chaos that once consumed the news cycle had finally gone quiet, leaving behind an eerie calm, the kind that follows after a storm, tears through a coastline, and leaves the air still heavy with salt and memory. Meghan withdrew from the public eye, canceling appearances and disappearing from the stage she had once commanded so effortlessly. The woman who had spoken with fire and conviction now retreated into silence, a silence that felt both peaceful and suffocating. For the first time in months, the cameras stopped clicking, but the world's gaze didn't truly turn away. Rogan, meanwhile, moved forward as if nothing had happened. His podcast continued, his audience grew, and the controversy that once threatened to swallow him became fuel for his legend. In the realm of public opinion, he emerged as neither villain nor victor, just inevitable. His ability to weather outrage only reinforced the mythology he'd built around himself, the man who couldn't be canceled, the voice too loud to be silenced. But somewhere beneath that bravado, there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible. His tone softened, if only slightly. The laughter that once rang cruel now carried an echo of self-awareness, as though even he had been changed by what had transpired. Analysts and cultural critics dissected the aftermath like scholars of a modern war. Some claimed Meghan had won, that her interview reclaimed her narrative, restoring her dignity and forcing society to confront its obsession with tearing women down. Others argued Rogan had triumphed, that he'd stood firm, unbothered, proving the resilience of unfiltered speech. But those who looked deeper saw something different. There were no winners here. The feud had stripped away the illusion of control that both had built their identities on. It exposed not just their vulnerabilities, but the fragility of fame itself. How easily it devours even those who believe they can command it. In Montecito, whispers circulated that Meghan spent her days in quiet reflection, surrounded by her family but distant in thought. She wasn't plotting a comeback or planning her next statement. She was, for once, still. Those close to her described her as contemplative, even serene, as if she had finally accepted that peace doesn't come from being understood, it comes from no longer needing to explain yourself. The woman who once lived to defend her story had finally learned the power of stepping back. But beneath that calm was an ache that never truly left. She had fought for her voice, yet now that she had it, the world's noise made her question whether it had been worth the battle. Rogan, too, moved on to new conversations, new provocations, yet, every now and then, when his guests spoke of fame or public image, he would pause that brief flicker of reflection, betraying a memory he couldn't quite shake. The feud had been brutal, exhausting, and deeply human. Two figures from vastly different worlds had collided, and both had walked away scarred, enlightened, and strangely alike. The media lost interest, but the internet did not. Old clips resurfaced, interviews replayed, quotes taken out of context, then reinterpreted years later. The argument lived on in fragments, not as a scandal, but as a cautionary tale. Fame, people realized, isn't a crown you wear proudly. It's a beautiful, glittering, and impossibly heavy chain. And once you put it on, you never truly take it off. Fade out, the world moves on, but the internet never forgets.